Welcome, everyone. This is Martha Fungo, a content manager from Ubuntu Net Alliance. Welcome to this webinar series on open science for discoverability of African research. We've been hosting these webinars for some time now, together with AfriArchive. And if you're not familiar with AfriArchive, this is a community-led digital archive for African research communication. By enhancing the visibility of African research, we enable discoverability and collaboration opportunities for African scientists on the continent as well as globally. Today, we welcome our speaker, Jerry Sellanga. I hope I got that right, Jerry. Is that how you pronounce your surname?
Yes. That's the correct pronunciation. Thank you.
Wonderful. So today we have Jerry Sellanga, CIPR from Invest in Open Infrastructure, and he'll be speaking on the topic, Investing in African Open Infrastructure. And before we listen to everything that he has for us today, here's just a bit of a background on Jerry. So Jerry currently works on the Invest in Open Infrastructure, IOI, as an engagement coordinator, where he uses his expertise to expand IOI's audiences through events, digital communications, and stakeholder management, especially in Africa. He specializes in strategic communication, graphic design, proposal development, and public relations. Jerry holds a bachelor's degree in environmental studies, majoring in community development from Kenyatta University, Kenya. And he's currently undertaking a postgraduate diploma in public relations. Before joining IOI, Jerry held senior roles in communication and marketing in the wildlife conservation, agriculture, and social impact sectors. In his spare time, Jerry is passionate about sports and spending time outdoors hiking. Once again, thank you all for joining us today, and over to our speaker, Jerry.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm trying to open my video. I can't. But thank you so much, Martha, Ebuka, and the rest of the guests who have joined us today. As the host has mentioned, my name is Jerry Sellanga. I work at Invest in Open Infrastructure. And I want to just give a bit of an exposition on the work that we are doing. So please allow me to share my screen, and then we can be able to kind of have a further discussion as I go through the slides I had prepared. So just 1 minute, then yes. Just slides, yes. And now, yes. So I trust that you're able to see my screen.
Yes, please, we can.
Okay, thank you. So as I mentioned, my name is Jerry Sellanga, Engagement Coordinator at Invest in Open Infrastructure, and it's a pleasure to be here at the Africa Archive webinar series. I just want to start with an introduction to Invest in Open Infrastructure. And one of the things about IOI is a non-profit organization that works to increase the investment and adoption of open infrastructure to further equitable participation and research. One of the things that we are seeing across particularly the research and academia scholarship and scholarly communication is that these days there's a lot of kind of barriers to access to knowledge. And one of the things that we realize is that for open knowledge to flourish, our systems need to be similarly designed. So one of the things that maybe would be interesting, particularly as we start this kind of conversation, would be looking at what exactly do we mean when we talk about open infrastructure. And I think perhaps maybe setting the grounding for this would actually make the presentation flow a lot easier. So according to our own definition of open infrastructure, this is a service, a protocol, a standard of software that the academic ecosystem needs to in order to perform its functions through the research life cycle. So when we talk about the research life cycle, there's a number of different things that are involved in the research life cycle. We have things like data collection, data analysis. We have the publication, we have the peer review. We have so many different components that are involved in the research life cycle. So we are looking at all of these kind of services, protocols, standards, or softwares that allow the facilitation of knowledge in this particular cycle. So when we talk about open infrastructures, according to IOI, we look at services that meet one or more of these criteria. One is that they meet the definition of open source software. Number two, they primarily work with open access content. Number three is that there's a free usability by anyone, is free of charge. Number four is also there's a big element of community governance and transparency in the operations of these infrastructures. And number five is these are services that are owned by, operated by non-profit or non-commercial entities. So when we're talking about open infrastructure, so what exactly is the problem that we are trying to solve? So across the world, there's so many different kind of problems that are there. For example, when you talk about increasing agricultural production, we are looking at the issue of climate change. We are looking at kind of how do we also enhance the health systems on the continent. And I think the COVID-19 actually gave us a very good example of this. But despite like this kind of belief that knowledge is imperative to solving these problems, these days there's a lot of barriers to kind of accessing knowledge. We are seeing a lot of things like consolidation. We're looking at issues of price gouging in certain aspects of research. For example, we are seeing a lot of kind of like publishers now buying a lot of tools that are involved in the research life cycle, whether that's something like maybe a retraction or maybe like something like maybe a journal systems. We are also kind of seeing, particularly when you're looking at the issue of gold. Yes.
Sorry, I'm sorry for interrupting you. I think we can see your screen, but we can't. What is showing in front of us is not your slide.
My connection is bad.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me now?
No, I'm not saying your connection is bad. What I'm saying is what is showing in front of us now. What we can see on your screen is not your slide.
Because at the bottom of the screen, I can see your screen sharing is paused. I don't know why.
Pause?
Let me stop sharing and then I share again.
Yeah, please try again. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Can you now be able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I was mentioning that there's a lot of kind of barriers that we are seeing, particularly when you're looking at access to knowledge in these days. So for example, there's two kind of different things that you can see on the screen. On the left, there's what we perceive to be the ideal, but then on the right, there's what we perceive to be the reality. So for example, a lot of kind of open infrastructures are dependent on funding from philanthropies and governments. But then on the other hand, these services are vulnerable to changes in leadership and struggle with funding for long-term operations. Another aspect is that community development and governance centers researchers' needs. But then also you're seeing that these same communities are kind of struggled with a lot of cost of development and maintenance without additional funding. I think one of the things, I don't know, maybe you've seen this before, is there's usually like this infographic that has this diagram of like an elaborate kind of like information architecture. But then at the bottom of that information architecture, there is the person who is kind of maintaining that particular service is just one person or a select group of people. And then the third thing is that open source solutions are customizable and are able to be built on and adapted as needs grow. But then also one of the things that we are saying is that implementation and usability of open source infrastructures can be costly and time consuming. And then one of the things that we're also seeing is that there's a lot of scarcity of funding that can lead to unhealthy and unnecessary costs and competition. So how do we now look to solve these challenges at IOI? So what we have three core pillars of our work. So we have the data room, we have what we call strategic support, and also we have the funding pilot. So in terms of data room, what we are looking at is just how can we be able to kind of reduce the information asymmetries that exist in order to actually make it easier to be able to adopt and invest in open infrastructure. When it comes to strategic support, one of the things that we have seen through our different engagements on the continent and even beyond is that sometimes when you talk about open infrastructure and their sustainability, it's not only funding that is an issue. There are also other issues, for example, to do with capacity building. There's issues to do with governance models. There's issues to do with community participation in these open infrastructures. And finally, we also have what we call funding pilots. So as the name of the organization states, we invest in open infrastructure, and we are looking at how can we be able to diversify the sources of funding for open infrastructures to ensure a healthy, resilient, and sustainable future for research and scholarship. So the totality of these three areas is what helps us to kind of advance our mission, which is to increase investment and adoption of open infrastructure across the world. So how do we work in terms of IOI? One of the things that is very, very core and central to our work is the fact that we take a research-driven approach. One of the things that is there is we always want to kind of understand the context or the region or the dynamics of a particular kind of context or institution before we actually able to kind of design an intervention or look at providing support that may be in the number of options I just mentioned in the previous slide. Then also we provide resources and analysis. So that could be financial, but also this could be in terms of knowledge, it could be in terms of networks and so on. And then also we pilot solutions and coordinate with stakeholders. I think one of the things, particularly as an organization that's headquartered in the global north, is that there's kind of sometimes issues where you find organizations thinking that they know best, and then they come and try to apply solutions that worked in different contexts and apply it to a different context. So what we try to do is we try to co-create, because everybody has knowledge. So how can we be able to bring all of these different insights that we have and kind of be able to create context-sensitive solutions that are going to further our agenda of making open infrastructure the default in research. So right now, I'm going to now give a bit of a deeper dive into what we are doing, particularly when it comes to the three core program areas of IOI. And one of the things that I mentioned with the data room is just here we are looking at tools and data that decision makers need to make decisions or recommendations to invest and adopt open infrastructure. So here we are looking at how do we now be able to break down those information asymmetries, and how can we make it easier for someone to kind of case make, even if I'm in an organization. For example, if I'm in a university, how can I be able to case make to my dean at the institution or to the university management that we need to kind of approach open infrastructure with the view of also promoting open science in the continent. And so some of the tools that we have is, I'm going to touch on only two. One is what we call InfraFinder, and the second is the State of Open Infrastructure Report. So when you talk about InfraFinder, one of the things that we are seeing here is sometimes finding the right research infrastructure is a slow and hard problem. Now, the reason why this is slow and hard is sometimes this information is scattered in so many different places. Sometimes it's it's going to take you a lot of time to actually be able to centralize all of this information and kind of be able to analyze and process that. And so those are some of the kind of dynamics of barriers that we are trying to solve through this InfraFinder program. And so one of the things that we are looking at here is particularly some of the considerations when we are doing like our focus groups or before we launched this product, is we were seeing like particularly from a lot of librarians and researchers who are working with open infrastructure, there was a lot of kind of ambiguity or lack of clear or centralized information on things to do with cost. So for example, if I'm going to onboard a new data repository, how much is this going to cost me in labor, time, and money, and also when it comes to maintenance? Another thing that is also important is particularly for people who are looking at implementing open infrastructure, is we're also looking at how do you de-risk. So for example, how do I have that certainty that if I am using an open infrastructure, I can be able to kind of get the necessary support, and also other institutions within my ecosystem are using similar or the same softwares, same infrastructures. And then the other one would be in terms of looking at interoperability, because this is quite an important thing in research these days, to comply also with the fair data principles. So what other kind of infrastructure or systems does that particular infrastructure need to run? And also, is it interoperable with some of the pre-existing kind of systems that are already at the institution or within the context that the researcher is working? And so I already touched on this in terms of the problem of scattered information, different requirements and needs for different institutions. And also it is time consuming to kind of analyze this. And so here what we have is InfraFinder, which is a free tool. And what InfraFinder does is more or less we are looking at just having a platform that can be able to give you different options of open infrastructures that might have utility within the scholarly communication space. So for example, this could be things like authoring softwares, it could be repositories, it could be book publishing systems. So having all of these tools in a centralized location, and then you can actually be able to kind of compare to look at different aspects. For example, like what technology or what tech stack is that tool built on? What are the governance kind of systems that that particular infrastructure uses? What is the funding kind of models that are in place? But also, we are looking at also what are the needs that these particular tools have. So this particular tool has a section at the bottom where the infrastructure can actually be able to say, we need maybe additional kind of capacitation on tech development in a particular language, or maybe we need financial kind of investment to scale up in a particular region, and also giving visibility to infrastructures now on a global level. So here, you actually have the ability to, if you scan this QR code, we have a form where if you have like an infrastructure that you would want to be housed on InfraFinder, then we can actually be able to have that. We'll be able to have that kind of for the next iteration of InfraFinder. So we actually are launching this tool on March the 22nd. And we have, I think, 57 tools from across the world. We have, I think it's 2 infrastructures from Africa. I think it's EduID, and there's another one that I'm forgetting. But also, one of the things that we are really kind of intentional on is how do we also give visibility to African infrastructures. So that's why if you're working within a particular open infrastructure that you would want to have on the platform, please scan this QR code, fill in the form, and we'll reach out to you. It's a completely free platform with the aim of giving these infrastructures more visibility on a global level. So next we have, particularly in the data room, we have also what's called the State of Open Infrastructure Report. So the State of Open Infrastructure Report, it builds on top of InfraFinder in terms of a big component of it is based on an analysis of some of the infrastructures that are on InfraFinder. And the aim here was to look at what are the trends, what are the patterns, what are the issues and the gaps when you're looking at investment and adoption of open infrastructure. And having this kind of analysis will now allow not only IOI, but the broader ecosystem to kind of figure out, okay, these are areas where we need more investment. These are areas where we can be able to collaborate and kind of share knowledge to actually be able to kind of advance scholarship on a global level. And also one of the things is that we have here is also we are looking to tell success stories of open infrastructures to demonstrate their viability on a global level. So here we are also looking at things to do with governance of open infrastructures, issues to do with grant funding. So what kind of changes are we seeing in grant funding? When you're looking at also issues to do with emergent topics, even in open infrastructure, for example, when you look at the topic of artificial intelligence, how does this interface with the open infrastructure? What are some of the potential implications that that may have? Or the issue of digital sovereignty, how does that interface with open infrastructure and how can that be applicable, or what lessons can we learn about that on a global level? So this State of Open Infrastructure report is launching in May. And also this is another free service is going to be there in terms of just kind of building out knowledge in the wider ecosystem. And we look forward to you all interacting with this report once it comes out. Then now moving on to the next core program area is where we have what is called funding pilots. And here when you talk about funding pilots, is just we are looking at research-driven kind of mechanisms to diversify the sources of funding for open infrastructure across the world. So here we are looking at mainly two core stakeholders group. Number one is looking at funders. So how can funding be more coordinated across the world to kind of support open data, open infrastructure, open content? And also how can now we be able to kind of look at sharing insights, sharing knowledge across funders so that we're able to kind of do funding in a more coordinated way? Because what we are seeing at the moment is there's a lot of pockets of funding, but they are not coordinated. And this added layer of coordination potentially would make sure that research is much more impactful on a global level. And then the next component that we have is we are looking at also how do we look at network partners. So network partners, for example, here we are looking at library consortia, research institutions, NRENs and RNs, and other kind of infrastructure service providers within the system. So how can they be able to kind of get much more catalytic funding to kind of advance open infrastructure across the world? So first, let me start with the Open Infrastructure Fund. And here, more or less, this was a fund that we started earlier. We actually started the process of developing the fund in October 2022. And actually, we disbursed the grants in January of 2024. And I'll explain why this particular process took so long. So the Open Infrastructure Fund is just aimed at strengthening the sustainability and resilience of infrastructures to increase their adoption across the world. And here we were looking at three core areas. We had capacity building, we had governance, and we had critical shared infrastructures. And the interesting thing about the Open Infrastructure Fund is 70% of the total amount of money that we had for this fund was actually ring-fenced and set aside for Africa and Latin America. The reason why we did this is we realized that particularly within Africa and Latin America, it's a lot more difficult to kind of get funding for open infrastructures and also in the view of how can we be able to kind of support the sharing and the visibility of African research initiatives. So that was the whole thought process behind the Open Infrastructure Fund. And one of the ways that we are looking at the fund was, number one, I mentioned that this took at least 1.5 years to develop. And the reason is that we are looking at how do we now increase participation in decision making. So for example, we had the initial concept of a fund, but then one of the reasons that we actually wanted to do this in a different way was we wanted to kind of crowdsource this to our community and to kind of our stakeholders and find out what exactly do you want to see in a fund? What topics do you actually want to be funded? And so we actually had a participatory kind of grant making, the decision making process on the fund, where we had like a pilot where people actually voted for which buckets of funding that they would want to be prioritized. And actually, that's how we got the 3 core program areas. And also, we also kind of did a bit of kind of canvassing on, okay, we're thinking of ring fencing this money for 70% of the funds for Africa and Latin America. And we actually also got the decision and buy-in of the community in this process. And also the other thing is just kind of adding an additional layer of transparency in terms of, okay, this is the amount of money we have. We want you to actually be able to kind of look at the proposals that are there because we had an open panel. The proposals are, even right now, I think they're on the open review portal, which we use for decision making. So everyone can actually see all of the proposals, and even the criteria for selecting these proposals was very clear. It was open. And now in terms of like the fund itself, we had 197 applications from across the continent, across the world, from 51 countries. And at the end of the day, we had 8 projects that were chosen for funding. And out of those 8, I think we selected, I think there was 2 from Africa. I think that is the consortium of Ugandan university libraries who are working on a project of upgrading their data repositories, and also the Africa Open Science Hardware in Accra, Ghana, who are working on an open flexure microscope to kind of make it easier to kind of diagnose diseases and enhance kind of medical research. So that is kind of like the work that we are doing on the Open Infrastructure Fund. We gave out the grants in January, and also now as the projects now start reporting, we'll be giving that feedback back to the community on our website and on our platforms. Then the other one is what we call the IOI Fund for Network Adoption. So if you look at the Open Infrastructure Fund, we were giving out grants of between $5,000 to $25,000 US dollars. But for the IOI Fund for Network Adoption, we are looking at providing funding of between $6 to $8 million, which is on a much bigger level than the Open Infrastructure Fund. And here, we are looking at partnering with at least 3 networks. So we are looking at having a network from Africa, having a network from Latin America, having a network from North America. And these networks need to kind of have a commitment to open science, open infrastructure principles, and also looking at kind of how can they also be able to kind of scale this up at a much bigger level. And here, one of the things that we are doing at the moment is we are in the process of raising this $6 to $8 million from a number of different partners. This could be from philanthropies, from research funders. It could be from even from commercial publishers, because, for example, one of the things that we see with commercial publishers is they derive a lot of benefit from the system, but then they don't invest in the system. So how can we also kind of look at broadening the pool of funders to kind of support open infrastructure? And here, actually, one of the things that is quite key is also we are looking at particularly the initiatives that we're going to support is how do these initiatives also kind of prioritize working on some of the developmental challenges that we see. Because, for example, in Africa, some of the challenges that we see are quite common. In Kenya, we have an issue, maybe, for example, of, let's say, lack of accurate climate weather prediction models. This is a problem that cuts across the continent. Or for example, how do we increase agricultural productivity? So how can you use open infrastructure to kind of be able to catalyze this research in these particular areas to kind of solve these emergent challenges that we see? And then also, we're looking at also the element of cross-pollination or sharing of information across the world. Because these days, we don't live in isolation. The guys in Latin America, for example, in La Referencia or in Clara, might have a lot of information that potentially we may benefit from, and vice versa. So that is kind of the model that we are trying to kind of propagate through the IOI fund for network adoption. So if your network is interested in kind of being a part of the IOI fund for network adoption, there's a QR code at the bottom here. You can be able to scan that code and it will take you to a form where you can be able to kind of sign up, just give us your email and then we'll be able to reach out to you. We best make sure that this fund that is coming up soon is going to be beneficial to the African continent. And also, even if you can be able to partner, like potentially if you're interested in being one of the grantees of the fund for network adoption, that also is very, very welcome, and we look forward to your engagements. I think maybe the final thing I'd want to say about this fund is that the fund is going to launch in, we are looking forward to launching this in Q3 or Q4 of this year. So more or less anytime from June, we are looking to launch. I think it's only subject to some funding confirmations that we have ongoing at the moment, and then we'll be soon in a position to launch. And then the final pillar of our work is what we call strategic support. So as I mentioned earlier, through our kind of research engagements, sometimes it's not just about funding, it's also about some of the adjacent kind of components to make sure that open infrastructure is able to thrive and actually be able to drive impact on the continent. So here we are looking at things like, how do we now enhance the governance capabilities? How do we look at diversified kind of funding models for our organizations? How do we also make sure that open infrastructures, even as they grow, are able to remain centered on the communities that they serve? So these are kind of some of the areas that we are working on. And particularly one thing that I would want to mention with the strategic support component is this is more or less like our kind of consultancy arm, or kind of like our kind of expertise advisory division, where we work hand in hand with open infrastructure providers to kind of look at how can we be able to enhance the sustainability and also enhance the impact of our open infrastructures. And so here, some of the things that we do in this context would be, for example, if an organization is looking at maybe onboarding an open infrastructure, it's kind of to help out with the due diligence component of that. If an organization or maybe a funder is looking at, okay, we would want to fund open infrastructure or open science in this particular region, can we be able to also support in due diligence for that? And so here we have just a number of examples that of work that we are doing. For example, with the Archive, which is one of the biggest kind of repositories of research data in the world. We are looking at kind of how do we be able to kind of enhance their community participation and governance structures. With BioArchive, MedArchive, we are looking at how do we diversify the financial support and enhance sustainability. And with the Catalyst project, we are looking at kind of developing a governance and sustainability plan for collaborative cloud infrastructures in Latin America and in Africa. So more or less in a nutshell, this is some of the work that we are doing on strategic support. If you would want to know more about our strategic support work, kindly scan the QR code here and we'll be able to have more information. So as I come to now the culmination of my presentation towards the end, I just want to kind of flag some opportunities for collaboration between IOI and open infrastructures and other players within the open science ecosystem on the continent. We are looking at how do we participate in our research tool and pilot development. For example, this could be through adding your infrastructure on InfraFinder, which is a free tool, also telling us about like what are the needs that you're seeing on the continent? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? Because I think the issue of kind of open access or open infrastructure is too broad to be solved by one entity. And so for us to actually be able to make meaningful strides, we all need to kind of come together and share insights together. And then the other one is to use IOI tools and research. For example, we have done quite a lot of work on the State of Open Infrastructure report. We also have done previous work or previous research work on, for example, topics to do with labor in open infrastructure, to do with funding in open infrastructure. And so all of these kind of different research products potentially could be useful. And then also the final one would be maybe to join IOI's sustaining circle to also help in terms of advancing the work that we do across the world. So as I get to the end of my slides, I would want to thank you for giving me the airtime. And also I'd want to ask if you can also be able to subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date with the latest updates. That would be appreciated. And we kind of can be able to keep the conversation ongoing on how can we be able to advance open infrastructure, open scholarship on the continent of Africa together. So thank you very much. And now let me pause there. Back to you, Martha, and also I'm looking forward to the questions that might be there. Yes. Aha. So I see a question here from Joe in terms of how can we collaborate with IOI for Africa Archive and also together with other infrastructure providers in Africa. That's a good question. And I think as I've just referenced in the last slide is like, we're looking at this as a collaborative mechanism or collaborative aspect because IOI does not have the silver bullet to kill all of these problems. And the only way that we can do this is together. So coming back to the question is, how do we collaborate with Africa Archive? I think Africa Archive in itself is an open infrastructure. I think for me, one of the things that I would look at first would be potentially how can we be able to now give Africa Archive more visibility? And this would be through potentially listing on InfraFinder, because this is a free platform. It's going to be global once it launches in 2 weeks' time. And so I think having Africa Archive there would be quite good because also we have an area where you can be able to showcase the work that you're doing and also to kind of also highlight the areas of additional support or additional investment that you require. So that would be number one. I think number two would also be maybe through the issue of funding pilots. And maybe because also Africa Archive kind of has a cross-cutting, not even kind of, it has a cross-continental mandate in terms of like sharing or making African research more accessible. So potentially there might be a conversation that might be had there about potential kind of collaborations or maybe potential kind of funding via the via the IOI Fund for Network Adoption that's going to be launched later in the year. And then also maybe the other thing that maybe would be there is just in terms of like exchange of information, particularly when you talk about if there's any kind of opportunities of interest that maybe Africa Archive or any other infrastructure service providers have, we are more than happy to kind of disseminate that at a higher level, but also even exchanging insights on, okay, we see this as a problem area, we see this as an opportunity area, we see this as an area where open infrastructure can actually be able to be catalyzed. How can we be able to synergize and work together? So I think those are some of the areas of collaboration that I see, Joe. I hope that answered your question. Then I see what can NRENs do on the national, and institutional level that you have identified. So this is actually like a very interesting question, because actually one of the things that I personally have been doing since I joined DIY in 2022 is that we have been working on engaging with NRENs and RNs to kind of understand like what are the dynamics of open source, open infrastructure within their context. And one of the things that we are seeing there is there's a big opportunity for particularly NRENs to kind of embrace open infrastructure. I think with COVID, I think this helped to catalyze that a bit, because, for example, institutions now, due to remote working, had to kind of look at what are kind of cost-effective yet scalable mechanisms of continuing with learning. And so you had an influx of a whole bunch of kind of open tools, for example, Moodle, Big Blue Button, all of these kind of open infrastructures that came into that system. But also from our engagement with NRENs, one of the things that we are seeing is that there is still a lot of work to be done, particularly on the advocacy side, when you're talking about things to even do like at the institutional level. There's a lot of advocates for open infrastructure and open science that are hampered by the fact that, okay, we don't have an open science policy, or we don't have an open access policy. So there's still a lot of work to be done there. There's also kind of work even at the national level, particularly with NRENs, to kind of look at how can also we be able to kind of push the governments at the national level to kind of have open science policies, prioritize open infrastructure. A good example would be in Sierra Leone, where through the LibSense work that WACREN does, is right now through the kind of work via the NREN, they are now kind of working towards implementing an open science policy at the national level. And you can see like this is something that is being driven by the NRENs. And that's not to say that the NRENs do this alone. The NRENs do this in collaboration with entities like, for example, IOI, it could be with IFL, it could be with Africa Archive. So it takes a village to kind of push this, but in my perspective, I think that NRENs have a very, very big role to kind of play when it comes to enhancing open infrastructures at the national level. Thank you for that question.
Yes, I think there is another question in the chat. Yeah, it says, what do you think will enable policymakers in Africa and globally to support investments in scholarly open infrastructure?
Yeah, I think this is a good question, and maybe perhaps I can give an analogy of like the domino effect. It's like when one domino falls, a lot of other dominoes kind of also fall. And I think that particularly when you're looking at policymakers, is if you look at the African landscape, I think Ethiopia was the first one in 2019 to come up with like a national kind of open access, open science kind of framework. And based off of that, you are now already seeing a lot of kind of developments in other areas. For example, in Uganda, in Kenya, even in Nigeria, Liberia. So once I think we start kind of doing that case making of, okay, this is what open infrastructure can actually be able to help you to achieve, then there's also going to be a lot more kind of nations that are going to kind of adopt open infrastructure, and also to support that even financially. Because last I checked, I think the African Union recommendation is that each country is supposed to kind of invest at least 1% of GDP on R&D. And I think that there's no African country that supersedes that. I think it's only Kenya and South Africa that I think are at around 0.8%. So also, as we see kind of this case making and what open infrastructure can be able to do, then also that potentially makes advocates of open infrastructure, like, for example, IOI, Africa Archive, and all of these different entities, it's much easier to kind of say, okay, this is the impact of open infrastructure. Why can't we be able to scale this up? I think also another important thing that is here is there's at this particular moment in time, excuse, at this particular moment in time is there's also a lot more awareness about open science in the continent. I think the UNESCO recommendations did a very good job in terms of looking at that particular component of open science. Open infrastructure is one of the key areas alongside open access, open educational resources, citizen science. And so like having like a global convention that kind of nudges people to kind of take this work forward, or kind of gives parameters of you need to prioritize this. I think that has also been really helpful in terms of advancing open science. And finally, I think the final thing that would be really important here is when it comes to the issue of public-private partnerships, because one of the things that we are all aware of on this call is that research is not prioritized in terms of the budgeting cycles. So they'll budget for all of these other things, which is healthcare, education, agriculture, but then the budget for R&D is quite little. So for example, maybe one of the things that maybe would be really helpful here in terms of like the budgeting cycles would be how can the private sector come in and collaborate with the government to also now look at furthering or catalyzing this work, because with governments, they are stretched from a prioritization perspective because there's so many problems to solve. And also the other thing with governments is their pace of operation is quite slow. On the other hand, you have private sector, which works in a very kind of fast way. There's kind of like that move fast, break things ideology that they have. And also in a lot of instances, you would find that private sector is much more efficient, and maybe they have the funding to actually be able to catalyze. So government and private sector collaboration is important because government needs to set a conducive environment for these private entities to work and also provide a suitable kind of regulatory framework. And I think that once we have more public-private sector collaborations, then open infrastructure on the continent is definitely going to be enhanced and catalyzed.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Jerry. I have another question. I guess you must have touched a little on it during your presentation, but I would like that you probably reiterate on it again. So the question is,
yeah,
can you again like reiterate some of the key challenges faced by African researchers in accessing and utilizing open infrastructure?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And the way I would look at it here would be particularly when it comes to African researchers and open infrastructure, is sometimes there's a lot of, and this is something that I even touched on in the previous question, is without the necessary kind of support that you have from a policy or an institutional level, sometimes it becomes very difficult for you to kind of be able to utilize or even access open infrastructures. Because, for example, when it comes to an issue to do with the university system, for example, in the procurement kind of cycles, do we have any provisions for open infrastructure? In most instances, you will get that this doesn't exist. Even in far more developed regions than Africa, also this still does not exist. So that can be a very big barrier to kind of utilization of open infrastructure. The other one is capacitation, and by capacitation is more or less I'm inferring about awareness, because sometimes you find, I was having this conversation with a researcher in one of these universities, and he's like, okay, for us, we understand at the operational level about open infrastructure, and we want to use it. But you see, for us to do that, we have to kind of do a bit of upward management in terms of I have to sell this idea to my university management, to the deans and the university kind of board, to kind of be able to open kind of change the way they've been traditionally working and kind of embrace these open infrastructure. So I think that also is a big issue. I think also the other kind of big issue that we have, particularly when it comes to utilization of open infrastructure, is also the issue of interoperability is still kind of gathering pace. It's still kind of not yet that embedded in our systems, where, for example, if we might look like the issue of, if I'm working in South Africa, can we be able to have some shared infrastructure that potentially may even make us to be able to save on cost, make it even more efficient by maybe reducing our overheads. And some of these kind of, the traditional way of working is kind of, we work in our own kind of nested silos. And so breaking down those kind of cultural ways of working is some of the issues that we are having at the moment. And maybe even the final one that maybe I would want to pinpoint is also when it comes to open infrastructure. Sometimes, like even when we have, let's say, open repositories on the continent, at the institutional, at the national level, but sometimes it is even a challenge, because how now do you get this information to also like the much kind of bigger ecosystems, for example, like Dataverse and these other kind of content repositories, to actually be able to kind of share your information and your research outputs. So those are some of the kind of key challenges that I see, particularly when it comes to accessing and utilizing of open infrastructures on the continent.
All right, thank you so much for those explanations and highlighting all of those challenges. Thank you so much. We are indeed grateful. All right, Martha, can you take it from here? Martha, are you there? All right, I think she is still having a little challenge. All right, there's a final question before we round up. We're about to touch down 12 o'clock. That's West African time. All right, this is the final question. It says, how can open infrastructure provide support in healthcare-related university projects? And this question is from Lukman Suleiman. How can open infrastructure provide support in healthcare-related university projects?
Okay, I think this is a good question, and also this there's actually at the Wakren 2024 conference that happened in Abuja last month. Actually, our executive director was moderating a panel on looking at the application of open infrastructure in agriculture, health, and in education. So there's a link that maybe I'll share with the Africa Archive team about that particular panel, because it answers a lot of these questions. Because one of the things that was there is, when you're looking at kind of health-related libraries, health-related universities, there's a lot of kind of problems, particularly when you look at the issue of support that is there. And maybe there's a lot of innovation that is happening, but this innovation is not yet being kind of utilized at scale. That may be due to institutional reasons, it may be due to kind of awareness reasons, it may be due to financial reasons. But also when you look at, for example, the West African Institute of Public Health, I think they are an entity in West Africa. It's like an association of public health universities that are actively looking at kind of integrating open infrastructures in how they are working to kind of make it easier to share research information. And then also, for example, when you look at the issue of accessibility, if you look at it in terms of even publication at the global level, some of the research that is published on, for example, tropical diseases is not very likely to be published in some of these, for example, in like some of these biomedical journals, like the top ones, because they'll prioritize diseases that more or less have an implication or kind of have a very close correlation to the context where some of these kind of predominant global journals are. But for example, you even have the Africa Health Sciences Journal by Dr. James Tusiimwe in Uganda, which is kind of doing a lot of good work in terms of prioritizing African health research. And so I think that open infrastructure has a very good opportunity to kind of facilitate the sharing of research data and research outputs, particularly when it comes to health. Even when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe that the Africa CDC had an open source kind of digital platform that facilitated the sharing of health information across the continent. So for example, you can already see in terms of like a very big pandemic that we had and where a lot of things were upside down, the fallback was in terms of open infrastructure. Even if you look at the issue to do with particularly the sharing of how do I call it, like the research data or the patents, which had to be relaxed. It's kind of looking at an open way of working to kind of be able to speed up the operation and kind of research into potential vaccines. Maybe finally, one of the things that I'd want to say here is also we are seeing, for example, a lot of collaboration across the continent in the issue of malaria research, because we have KEMRI, the Kenya Medical Research Institute, which is also now sharing their data with other African research institutions in an open manner to kind of also facilitate research on vaccines on malaria and also HIV. So in principle, what I'm saying is that open infrastructure has a big role to play, but this can only happen when we have all of these different kind of players in the same room. We need to have the guys who are from the health institutions. We need to have the guys who are doing the open infrastructures. We need to have the funders. We need to have governments all working in synergy to actually be able to catalyze that health-related research at the university level.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jerry. It's indeed wonderful having you as our guest today. It's really, like you've said, it is important that we all put our hands together to help promote research in Africa. All right, so our guest today has been Mr. Jerry Sellanga from Invest in Open Infrastructure, and he has been speaking to us on the topic investing in African open infrastructure. And we have indeed learned a lot from all he has explained to us today. So I want to say a big thank you to Mr. Jerry Sellanga for joining us, and a big thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today in our webinar session. We still have so many other webinar sessions that are upcoming, so do well to visit our website at www.africacarve.org/webinars to see our upcoming webinars that we still have in the year. So let me use this opportunity to say a big thank you to each and every one of you for joining us today, and see you in our next webinar session. Thank you all, and do have a wonderful day. Bye.